Revelation 7:9 paints a vibrant vision of heaven that includes people from all nations, tribes, and tongues. For the believer, an experience in heaven will consist of interactions with people from all time periods, all cultures, all countries, and all age groups. And get this, we aren't just talking of people who have already lived, died, and gone to be with Jesus. We will be worshiping with Jesus with people from cultures and time periods that have not even existed yet. Interacting with different kinds of people might seem glorious to some of us and burdensome to others of us. You may be thinking, how in the world are we all going to get along? We all have different desires, experiences, languages, cultures, interpretations, you name it, all different. I was getting my hair cut last week, and while I was waiting my turn, a man in his 70s started talking to me. Typically, because I'm an introvert, I try to avoid discussions like this. But for some reason, I engaged with him, and in our conversation, we discussed multiple experiences of how he grew up, in comparison to how I grew up. We both grew up in similar households, but were separated by about 50 years of experience. Here's what I know about our experiences though. Despite some similarities, we both have radically different perspectives on life. We see different things as important, we have different desires, we prefer different likes and dislikes, even down to the clothes we were wearing. So totally different. But despite our differences, we were both loved by the same God, were redeemed by the same Jesus, and have faith in the same gospel. But the truth of the matter is, the way the gospel was presented and communicated to this man had to be and was very different from the way the gospel had to be and was presented to me. See, when we're living on mission and have accepted the call to proactively engage our neighbors, co-workers, friends, family members with the gospel of Jesus Christ, we must do it with the presentation that will resonate with them. This process is something that church leaders call contextualization. Now, contextualization is the attempt to communicate the gospel and establish the church in ways that make sense to people within their local cultural context. Believe it or not, all of us who have been in church for some time have experienced contextualization. I think back to some of the largest battles in recent church history. Pews or no pews, drum kits or choirs, lights on or lights off, pulpit or pub table. The approaches to church and ministry that worked for your parents probably did not work for you and your understanding of the gospel. See, but I'm not just talking about preferences or advocating for a catering to you approach. But what I am saying is that there are certain things that are held as valuable for collective cultures that impact the way we receive and process information. Contextualization cares about more than preferences of a generation. It is an attempt to get at the heart of what helps different groups process information. It takes into account the location of where a specific culture is located. It considers how religious and historical background impacts accepted beliefs or perspectives. It addresses the reason why different terminology is used when people speak the same language. Living on mission requires us to be creative in the approach of how we minister to other people. I want to break down contextualization on a practical level that makes it easy for us to grasp onto. Contextualization is not easy by any means. However, these 4 principles that I'm going to explain are pillars that help form a balanced approach. The first is this: study the context. If we love the people whom we are reaching, we want to understand how they think and respect where they are coming from. In Acts 17, the Apostle Paul finds himself ministering in Athens, and upon entering the Areopagus, or the city hall for Athens, he sees an altar addressed to the unknown God. And look what Paul did. He went into the Areopagus because he knew that was where the town debate happened. It's where all the influential people came. It's where the conversations were centered. And if he was going to preach the gospel, the Areopagus was the best place in Athens to preach it. He knew the cultural context of first century Athens. Paul cared enough to know what mattered to the Greeks and discovered the best way to preach the gospel. Make it practical when you're doing the same. When you are ministering to people, do you know their context? Don't be weird about it and try to dress to impress a certain culture, but know what they think and why they think that way. The second thing when creatively sharing the gospel is this: we have to find the connecting points. Now, Paul did something else in Acts 17 worth investigating. Paul sees the altar to the unknown God, and not only does he use it as an opportunity to unveil the unknown God as a knowable Jesus Christ, but Paul does it by bringing the Greeks into conversation by quoting one of their revered poets. Don't be scared of how people are different than you. Find the connecting points and see where Jesus connects to their life. Now, sometimes there's a tendency to be afraid of seeing how Jesus connects to a different culture. Remember, Jesus is good news to all people. Therefore, the manner in which he is good news is different for each person, and that does not change the fact that he still is good news for all. Here's an example. Jesus calls himself the bread of life in John 6. That was great news to the people of first century Israel because they were literally living on bread day by day, not knowing where their next meal was going to come from. But that would make almost no sense to us in our cultural context in the western part of the world. If we're hearing it for the first time now, perhaps Jesus would say something like this: I am the sustenance of your soul. It conveys the exact same good news, but does so in a relatable way for where we are now. As we wrap up, the last two can be shared connected to each other. Pay attention to people's needs and think globally. In session 3, we looked into the idea that when Jesus preached the gospel, he announced the arrival of the kingdom of heaven, and he healed the sick and cast out demons. Each of us have needs, and oftentimes the needs people have are the starting point for where contextualization and creative ministry can occur. But as you do that, continue to think globally. And what do we mean? Think outside of yourself while still being yourself. Lay down your preferences if it means that a wall comes down for someone else to see Jesus. The most Oklahoman thing is bringing people over to your house for smoked meats. But what if the person you are attempting to evangelize has an aversion to certain kinds of meat because of his cultural upbringing? If the meat you want to have is something that would cause a stumbling block to him, maybe don't have that meat. I want to leave you with this thought because I know to some of you contextualization may not be something you totally agree with. But don't get caught up in this way or that way or doing something a certain way because it's all you know or have experienced. The idea of contextualization is at the very nature of God's Word. The New Testament, God's Word, is a product of contextualization. The New Testament was written in the Greek language, which coincidentally was the language that would go on to form Western society, but Greek was not the language Jesus spoke. Jesus spoke Aramaic, which was similar to biblical Hebrew. And here's the cool thing. Christianity is the only major religion that has its holy book written in a language different from that of its central figure. Some see that as a problem, but in reality that is great news because if we listen, we can hear the meaning behind this peculiarity. We can approach God and worship God in ways that we understand. If that is true for us, it is true for all people. As you go out this week and continue to live on mission, challenge some of your tightly held views concerning the method of outreach and see how you can share the gospel with someone using tangible ways that they would understand.